Then how you can see the units are rotating round and round. That's kind of cool. And number two, what is your speed of what will be the output yield of the selectivity. Yes, I agree. Like, number two, number two, that's 150. I
Miami. Everybody okay with my English? Bahasa? I don't know any questions. Everybody knows what I'm saying. But experience in the U.S. has been very interesting. And after I finished Yeah, in 1992, because my dad at that time had a second heart attack already, and I felt responsible for being the only child not married. My brothers and sister had already gotten married, so I came back to Indonesia to look after my dad a few times before I rejoined the professional career of banking, which I did for a number of years. I worked at a bank in Indonesia, then I went back after several years to the US to pursue my second master's, and I worked a little bit in the US, and I worked in Singapore for about five years. I did investment banking for quite many years, and I did a little bit of investment, at an investment company in Singapore. Then I rejoined investment banking. Then I went back to Indonesia, and this is where it got a little interesting. I basically made a decision to become an entrepreneur in 2008, and this was a few years after I finished my policy studies in the US. This was at the Kennedy School. I finished my policy studies in 2000, or the year 2000. And after a few years of working in banking and in an investment company, I basically decided to take a little more risk as an entrepreneur, which I became almost for 2 years until I was asked by President SBY to join the government. And at that time, the position that was slotted for me was the position of being the chairman of the investment board. And I did that for about 2 years until I got transferred over to the Ministry of Trade. I think what's interesting about this is that if I had gone back in time, I did not have the ability to pontificate that I was going to be able to do a few things by way of getting a policy education. The typical mindset about anybody who goes to a policy school is that he or she is going to work as an assistant to the senator or an assistant to the governor, or basically being either in government or maybe NGO. Never in the mind of anybody, at least within, a few friends away from myself, was there the thinking that anybody that would have gone to a policy school could do, entrepreneurship, could do policy making, could do banking, could do anything. And this is the message that really I want to convey to you. And it's not basically fixed to the idea of going to a business school or a management school to be able to pursue a business career or entrepreneurship. It's not about going to a policy school just to be a policymaker. And when I did join the government, it wasn't too different from the way of thinking when I was a banker or when I was an entrepreneur. When you're a banker, you're in the business of maximizing your client's value and also maximizing your shareholders' value. And when you're an entrepreneur, you're in the business of maximizing your own value and hopefully the people that work for you and the people that work with you. And when you're in government, you're in the business of basically the co-creation of the maximum number of goods. Now, unfortunately, we don't have that many people being interested in policy studies. Okay, I was the only Indonesian that went to the Kennedy School. Before me, there was one Indonesian. After me, there was one Indonesian. In my class, we had about 7 Chinese from mainland China. We had about 5 Hong Kongese. We had about 5 or 6 Singaporeans. And I discovered that the 10 years before I was there, every year of the 10 years before I was there, China had sent 7 to 10 every year. Singapore had sent 5 to 7 every year. India had sent 5 to 8 every year. And everybody else was just so committed to sending as many people as possible. Whereas Indonesia had a pretty different profile. One year there could be nobody, another year there could be somebody. But it's never been more than somebody. And that, I think, is pretty sad. Because this is a country that's blessed in terms of being the third largest democracy in the world, the fourth most populous country in the world, the 15th largest economy in the world that has a chance in $1,200 to $600. Then, post-Suharto, we had Habibie, Gus Dur, and Megawati, who were able to basically escalate the income per capita from $600 to $1,100. Then came SBY in 2004. In the last 9 years, he's been able to escalate the income per capita from $1,100 to $4,000 last year. And inshallah, in 2014, we may be able to crank it up to $5,000. And he would be the only president, plus farmers in this country, make sure that they have the right to cultivate the land, and so would their children, grandchildren, and their great-grandchildren, in order for there not to be any alteration in the usage of the land that's been cultivated. To anybody that wants to be an industrialist in China. Whereas here you pay an interest rate of 15, in China 2%. Here you pay more for electricity, a lot more than what people are paying in China. In China, people get tax holidays for 10 to 20 years for anybody that wants to be an industrialist. I've always made the argument that if an Indonesian were to try to make a handphone, it's probably going to cost about $50 to $100. A lot more than what the Chinese are making. But if we can brand it ourselves, there's no reason for us not to be able to sell that at a lot cheaper price than the Samsungs, the Galaxies, and the iPhones and the Blackberries of the world. We can brand it Budi. We can brand it Tuti. And we don't have to sell it as highly as $600 to $700 that you all are paying for the beautiful Blackberries that you are having. And you will still be making money. And here's the stats. Last year, we imported 60 million handphones. One handphone that's made overseas is one handphone that can actually be made here. And every handphone that can be made in Indonesia is one handphone that can produce probably about 10 to 20 jobs. Imagine 60 million handphones. How many jobs are those going to be able to create in Indonesia? Be it in Jakarta, Kebumen, Banjar, Jember, Mamuju, whatever. And when we're talking about equity, growth with equity, we're talking about creating as many jobs as possible. Not those guys that are just digging the ground and getting the bauxite, the nickel, and what out of the ground, but it's really creating jobs by way of allowing ourselves to move up the value chain. And I'm not talking about asking you guys to make satellites. I'm not talking about asking you guys to make rockets. But it is a simple thing that we need to basically gravitate to and embrace. And that's, I think, the number of investigators. Do you know how many investigators are there in KPK? You tell me. Anybody want to take a guess?
300.
Hmm?
300.
A little too optimistic. 60? A little too pessimistic. Hmm? A little too optimistic.
80,
Huh?
80,
90?
80.
Very little pessimistic.
100.
100. There you go. Could somebody bring a donut to this guy?
I'm okay.
100. You know how many public officials there are in Indonesia? Exactly. You remember because I quoted it earlier. The ratio is 100 to 4.5 million public officials. So that's 1 to 45,000. You know what Hong Kong had in terms of the ratio between investigators and the public officials? And it took Hong Kong 30 years to eradicate corruption. Anybody, take a guess. 1 to 200, actually. Very close. Imagine our ratio is 1 to 45,000. If the future leadership is not going to address this, I think we're going to wait a long time for corruption to be completely eradicated. Surely we've got to ensure the marginal increase of welfare for everybody that works in the government. You know, I get a little resentful when I talk to my Singaporean counterparts who make a lot more money than I do as public officials. But they pay public servants really, really well. And it is a deterrent to committing corruption. But I think we've got to be serious about the KPK. And I basically have articulated many times that if we want to be effective, the future leadership of this country has to increase the number of investigators in KPK from 100 to 4,500. So at least that we have a ratio of 1 to 1,000, not 1 to 45,000. And I think the future leadership has got to make sure that the KPK has a branch in every one of the 34 provinces. When we do that, I think we're serious. Because if you take a look at the surveys with regards to corruption in Indonesia, it's actually a lot more pervasive in the regions. It's not just in Jakarta. And they relate to 3 topics. Pendidikan, kesehatan, dan permodalan. Just those 3. That's where corruption takes place. So I think, you know, I hope you all gravitate to stuff like this. The next item that I want to talk about is, what are we going to do? What do we have to do to do all these? To build the infrastructure, to increase the quality of education, to increase the budgetary allocation for corruption, eradication, and all that.
Less than 10%.
Less than 10%, very good. Exact number, what?
8%.
10 million.
20 million.
20 million. Can you imagine? We got 120 million workers, but only 20 million people and corporates are paying taxes. About 18 million individuals and about 2 million companies. Guesstimate. It tells you right there the problem and the solution. And you can be business-centric about it, and you can be policy-centric about it. And what does it take for the government to increase its capacity of getting infrastructure built out, whatever build out faster and more? Get more people to pay taxes, right? No reason for the future leadership not to be able to increase the number of taxpayers from 20 million to 30 million, 40 million, 50 million. And I think the future leadership ought to consider, after having increased the number of taxpayers, he or she can consider what? Lowering the tax rates. How about that? The individuals now pay tax rates of what? Hmm?
15%.
No, I wish.
Maximum 35%.
Huh?
35%.
There you go. 30 to 35%. Corporates pay how many percent? 20 to 25. If you're publicly listed, you pay 20%. But if you're non-publicly listed, you pay 25%. Singapore and Hong Kong, they've been proactive. They've been aggressive in lowering tax rates to about 15%. There's a study empirically that corroborates the argument. The lower you lower the tax rates, the more tax revenues you get. Now, two things you got to do. First is you got to increase the number of taxpayers. By way of, I would be as bold as giving tax amnesty to anybody that hasn't been paying taxes in the last God knows how many years, 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 years, 40 years. As long as there is no criminal record. That would be my view. And I think we can quite easily capture 10 to 20 million more. And I think we can quite easily increase the government budget from 180 billion or 1,800 trillion rupees to double the number, 3,000, 4,000 trillion rupees. When you have that kind of money, boy, imagine what you can do. This campus is not going to be big enough because the government could be giving a lot more scholarships to people who want to attend SGPP. That was a joke. The government could allocate a lot more money for the building of bridges, roads, ports, airports, railways, power generation capabilities, and all that good stuff. It's an amazing future, and it's for you to grab it. How many of you are here in the category of 20 to 30 years old? Okay, we got a few hands up. In 20 years' time, when you are 40, assuming you're 20, okay, when you're 41. When you're 41, Indonesia has the potential of being the 7th or the 6th or 5th largest economy in the world. And I'll be damned if you're not using an Indonesian-made handphone by then. So, I think it's clear where the problem is and where the solution is from a fiscal standpoint. Now, I can talk about many other things. I've talked about agriculture. I've talked about education. I've talked about infrastructure. I've talked about corruption. And I've talked about increasing the fiscal space. Now, you ever imagine what it takes for people or more people to pay more taxes? You can give them amnesty, or you can do what? You think people or more people have passports than those that are paying taxes? How about linking the immigration system to the tax system? You know, I lived in Singapore for 5 years. There was one time when I was late in paying taxes. And I went to the airport. I was about to board a plane. And as I was at this immigration desk, the guy stopped me. Sir, you can't. Why? Can you go to the corner? So they put me in this aquarium. And they told me that I was late in paying taxes. Great system. What if you can link the two systems? You can basically find out who hasn't been paying taxes at all or who hasn't been paying taxes in the last quarter. That's one way. And I think if we can increase our tax ratio using the OECD methodology is about 15.5%. That's the ratio of the tax revenues to the GDP. Which makes sense because our GDP is $1 trillion and our tax collection is about 150 billion US. The total budget is 180 billion. There's other non-tax revenues. Now, if we can increase our tax ratio from 15.5% to, let's say, 20, even 25, the developed countries in Europe and the US, they have a tax ratio of about 30% or over. Now, if we can increase this, I think we can do lots of things. Let me stop right there and happy to take questions. Thank you. Yeah.
We were having discussion about having the field research outside Indonesia,
Yeah.
whereas most of the students here in the school are from Indonesia, and some of us think that it will be more beneficial for the students if they do the research in Indonesia. Having spent most of your time outside Indonesia, and then you have to go back here facing.
I'll take that back. Having spent much of my time, not most of my time.
Okay, much of your time outside Indonesia and having experienced how the market out there and how the system out there, and now you have to apply them here. How do you find it? Do you think your experience outside Indonesia is very useful to see the context here and then apply what you found there here, or you just
Not
use it?
necessarily. If any, it wasn't my experience in the U.S. that I found most useful. It was probably my experience in Bangladesh. I lived in Bangladesh for 2 years, and having lived there for 2 years made me appreciate Indonesia. Because when I left Indonesia, I thought Indonesia was pretty bad, but boy, when I went there, it's Indonesia is not so bad. Then you start appreciating, you start loving your country, you start becoming more nationalistic. That's why I joined the government. No, I'm just kidding. But then I moved to India. I thought Bangladesh and India were very, very colorful experiences for me. They're very, very smart people, very energetic people, and I learned, how basically they, go through the hardships and difficulties. But going back to the topic of research, our R&D as a ratio to the GDP is very little. It's 0 point something % of the GDP. We take a look at Singapore. They're spending about 3 to 4% of their GDP on R&D, and a lot of that is actually being done by the private sector. And it's being done by the private sector because there's fiscal incentives. Anybody or any company that spends money on research and development, they get a tax deductible. Similarly with tourism, any company that wants to promote Singapore, for the purpose of tourism and they get a tax deductible. I'm not so sure if it's 200 or 300% of what they spend. So basically, if they spend $100 on research, on their tax return, they basically use $200 to $300 as a deductible to the income. So that lowers your, taxable income. And that inherently is an incentive for anybody that wants to do research, especially if it helps the country and the nation. And that's something that we haven't done yet. And this is something that we got to do. And usually the ratio of research and development spending is 1 by the government and 2 by the private sector. So every dollar that's being spent by the government, $2 are being spent by the private sector. And here, I'm not seeing a whole lot of spending being done by either. And this is something that I think we can only encourage by way of giving fiscal incentives. And it's doable. And you can start doing that once you can enlarge your fiscal space. So net, you don't have to go outside to do research. You can actually do it here, as long as you know that the policymakers get it right. Oh, okay. I'll take both of you, but yeah, please.
My name is Gita Wirjawan. I'm in Indonesia since many years. I know Ibu Pola quite well.
You know what?
Ibu Pola.
Oh yeah, thank you. That's my mom.
This bridge is my mother-in-law, my late mother. I have 2 questions. The first one is regarding your unfold. And then I have another gentleman who comes to my mind immediately that I've met recently, Johannes Surya, who has the same kind of dream as you have. But
We're
he's
friends.
in technology, and he wants more Indonesian PhD in America, as you know. So, I mean, you probably know the gentleman also.
Johannes?
Yeah.
Yeah, he's a very good friend. Yeah.
And then I believe the two of you, I mean, the schools are completely different, but this is an interesting experience for the country, right? We need, in order to make these phones, we need more engineers, more technicians, right? The second question is regarding equity. We need equity, right? We are short of equity. not too long ago. It was
Equity as in capital or equity as in income
capital
distribution?
general, right?
Capital, okay.
Capital, either long-term debt of. And then, not too long ago, somebody mentioned that the total of the concession, the pyramid of Total in the Mahakam River should be revoked by 2017 for a number of reasons. Legally, it's perfectly true, and
Yeah.
the intentions are,
Right.
of course, clear. My question is, by doing this, don't you think that we might give the foreigners, I say might because I've been in Indonesia so long that now I'm consider myself Indonesian, that might give the wrong signal to foreign investors. We need foreign investors to share the risks,
Yeah.
to bring not only capital but also expertise. We also need expertise. So that's my two questions.
Okay. First of all, on handphones, I don't think it is absolutely necessary for every handphone to be made by a university graduate. I think a polytechnic graduate can make handphones. As long as there's capital, as long as there is competitiveness in terms of the cost structure, whether it's the cost of the building, the cost of land, the cost of the interest rate, the cost of the electricity, the cost of infrastructure for transporting the goods from the factory to the port and what have you. But I want to share with you the example of Foxconn. Anybody know the company called Foxconn? Right? It's a company in Taiwan. You know how many patents they have produced? One single company. They have a policy. If they have 100 employees, 20 of the 100 have to be engineers. And 20% of the 20 have to have PhDs. So for every 100 employees, 4 have to be PhDs and 20 have to be engineers. They have 16,000 patents. One company. You know how many patents Indonesia got in 2010?
10.
5,000. You can imagine one company in Taiwan has 16,000 patents. And Indonesia altogether got 5,000 patents. That's a reflection of education. Okay? I mean, you know how many Koreans are there in Harvard? 700 to 1,000. 5 Indonesians. You know how many Chinese are there at Columbia University? 1,200. 11 Indonesians. You know how many Chinese are there at Cambridge? You know how many Americans are there at Cambridge? 750. 750 Chinese, 750 Americans. You know how many Indonesians? 11. This is not a pro-foreign university statement. This is about being exposed to whatever is happening anywhere in the world, including in Kebumen, but also including at Oxford. So that at the time when these guys come back from all the best universities from the world, they could mingle with the graduates of the best universities in Indonesia. And you know what happens when you mix them up? You get the best result that has a taste of national interest and international interest. This is the era of Indonesia's becoming a global player. You can never think that we're not a global player. We are the largest Muslim country in the world, rich with pluralistic values. We are the third largest democracy in the world. We are the fourth most populous country in the world. We're the 15th largest economy. Never can you think that we're not global. Remember that. And education is key. Making handphones here is key. Now the second is with regards to the Mahakam. This was a topic last week at the presidential debate. My take on this is I'm in favor of a local state-owned entities taking over the block, provided it has the capital and it has the knowledge wherewithal. We can't insist on taking over something that's been done by our partners for decades without necessarily facilitating the technical know-how or wherewithal. But if we're not in a position to have the necessary financial wherewithal and also the technical wherewithal, forget it. Now, we have to do it in ways that are acceptable in the international community. We're not in an era of disrespecting contracts. We live in an era of respecting contracts. Now, I've always said, I've been very clear about how nationalism ought to get defined. Nationalism is not about necessarily who owns. It's really more about who benefits. We've got to be very clear about it. You know, I was asked by the moderator, well, you think we should recalibrate the distribution of income from 30% for the local government to a much larger percentage? You know what my answer was? What's better? 30% of 100 or 5% of 1,000? What would you want? You want 30% of 100 or 5% of 1,000? We've got to make sure that our human resources, SDM kita, are capable of increasing the total pie from 100 to 1,000. But if we're not focused on increasing the pie, forget about the discussion on percentages. What's better, 1,000% of nothing or 1% of 1,000? That's how you define nationalism. That's how you define how you proceed with regional autonomy. You tell the leaders of the region, this is how we do business. But the way we do business has to be educating and promoting of growth. And promoting of growth with equity. SBY has been very, very adamant about producing growth that's pro-growth, pro-job, pro-poor, and pro-environment. It's key. And I think the future leadership has got to be steadfast about making sure that our economic development is inclusive. It's tasted by everybody. Next question. Yeah.
Currently there
A real economic critical mass. And they have, I think, escaped from the middle income trap by way of being able to industrialize themselves. You know, have you ever been to Pohang? Anybody been to Pohang? Pohang is the city of steel. Steel as in S-T-E-E-L, not S-T-E-A-L. They make steel. They're the third largest steel maker in the world, POSCO. If you go to the factory there, there's a big poster. You know what it says? It's a poster of the letter of rejection from the World Bank when they asked for a loan, when they wanted to build the first big factory. 40 years ago, they had a capacity of 2,000 or 2 million tons per year, same as Krakatau Steel. Today, you know how many tons Krakatau Steel has? 2.5 without the POSCO element. You know how many POSCO has in terms of capacity? 40 million. So they've been able to go up from 2 million tons a year to 40 million tons a year, and Krakatau Steel has been able to go up from 2 million to 2.5 million. And they were able to go like this to the World Bank. Okay, if you don't want to give me a loan, we'll figure out a way. And they figured out a way to finance themselves. You know, the question on equity, it's very simple. If we take a look at the banking system, what's the asset size of the banking system in Indonesia? Close. It's actually 450 billion US. 450 billion US. Most of that is in what? 12 months deposits on the liability side. There's not a whole lot of liquidity being parked in long-term duration. That's a problem. This country needs roads. How do you fund roads? With long-term funding, right? If I built a road today, you think I'm going to break even by tomorrow? No way. If I'm lucky, maybe in 10 years. So it's got to be supported by liquidity that's in long-term duration. And it takes one policy to change the instrumentation duration from 12 months and below to longer duration. That's one way to equitize the system, to make sure that there's more money for people who can be creative. You know, I was in a session a couple of days ago, people in the creative economy were complaining, no access to capital. You bet your whatever. Because the money is sitting in time deposits. It's not sitting in long-term instruments. Once the money is reparked to long-term instruments, then we can start dancing. We can start dancing with, hey, you've got a great idea. How long will it take you to get your money back? 5 years? Okay. Boom. Because I'm supported by an instrument that funds me long-term.
Dan lain-lain gitu kan. Tapi ternyata ketika terjun lagi ke lapangan, terjun lagi ke masyarakat, ini tidak sesuai gitu dengan apa yang dibutuhkan oleh masyarakat gitu. Kadang pemerintah membuat undang-undang tentang perdagangan, undang-undang tentang keamanan, pertahanan dan lain-lain. Akan tetapi masyarakat yang ada di masyarakat itu justru itu tidak kondusif gitu, tidak efektif gitu. Jadi bagaimana saya mempunyai mimpi untuk membangun bangsa saya sendiri, Indonesia, yang tidak diinjak-injak oleh negara lain, dan bahkan kita lebih maju dari Amerika gitu kan ya, bisa sejajar minimal.
Atau nggak disadap?
Iya. Setidaknya tidak disadap gitu, bagaimana supaya.
Nih mumpung ada bule, saya ngomong bahasa Indonesia aja. Nanti kita sharing rahasia.
Supaya teori dan praktek atau teori itu sesuai dengan apa yang ada di masyarakat seperti itu. Jadi masyarakat itu tuh nggak butuh ilmu gitu, tapi butuh makanan, butuh pendidikan dan butuh modal gitu. Bagaimana mereka bisa tetap bertahan hidup dan tidak melakukan apa yang dilarang oleh undang-undang seperti itu. Terima kasih. Wassalamualaikum.
Waalaikumsalam. Oh, ini pertanyaan yang bagus. Kalau saya boleh ulangi tadi yang pertama saya ceritakan adalah ketahanan pangan. Di mana seorang pemimpin, sorry guys, I'm gonna have to switch. Pertama yang harus dilakukan oleh seorang pemimpin itu adalah reformasi agraria. Kalau kita lihat di Jawa Barat, itu ada kurang lebih 6-7 juta orang yang sangat miskin. Anda dari mana kampungnya?
Jawa Barat.
Jawa Barat kan? Di mana? Saya nebak soalnya. Garut kan? Di Jawa Barat, populasi 35 juta. Yang miskin di situ, yang sangat miskin, itu 7 jutaan. Dan 40% dari 7 juta manusia di Jawa Barat yang sangat miskin, itu ada di sektor pertanian. Dan ini warna yang hampir sama di provinsi-provinsi lainnya. Kenapa? Karena seorang petani, kalau ditanya, Anda tuh kendalanya apa sih? 4. pengairan, hama, kredit atau akses modal, sama pasar. Sama satu lagi pupuk. Pupuk tuh sulit sekali. Mereka kalau dari kecamatan yang satu ke kecamatan yang di sebelahnya, itu dipersulit. Kadang-kadang ditangkap polisi. Nah, jadi kalau 4 atau 5 hal ini bisa diatasi, kemiskinan di kalangan petani dan buruh petani itu sangat bisa diatasi. Makanya saya mengusulkan kita harus melakukan reformasi agraria untuk memberikan keyakinan ke setiap petani dari 40 juta petani yang ada di Indonesia bahwa dia bisa mengelola lahannya dan tidak akan terjadi alih fungsi. Dan lahan itu bisa dikelola oleh dia sendiri, anaknya, cucunya, cicitnya. Supaya besoknya nggak dibikin lapangan golf, nggak dibikin mall, nggak dibikin futsal dan segalanya. Nah, kalau ini bisa dilakukan, ini akan menjadi baseline untuk kita bisa membuahkan ketahanan pangan. Hanya dengan ketahanan pangan.
Kalau lapangan golf tengahnya ada padi-padi juga bagus.
Ya, nanti dulu deh. Kalau kita punya ketahanan pangan, baru kita bisa melakukan apapun yang kita inginkan, industrialisasi dan segalanya. Saya sih tetap berpendapat bahwa pendidikan itu penting. Jangan beranggapan pendidikan nggak penting. Tanpa pendidikan yang bermutu, kita tidak bisa mengurangi harga atau biaya bibit. Tanpa pendidikan yang bermutu, kesejahteraan lahir dan batin untuk semuanya secara inklusif. Tapi kalau kita nggak ada makanan di meja makan setiap rumah tangga, sulit. Dan itu mulai dari sektor pertanian. Oke, berikutnya. Ini Pak, silakan.
Saya mau mengajukan 3 pertanyaan.
Dalam bahasa Indonesia juga.
Okay, Excellency, I have 3 questions.
Don't call me Excellency. I'm no longer a minister.
On KPK and fiscal.
Yeah.
You mentioned about the KPK. I just read the newspaper. I think one of major newspaper accused the current administration it's trying to limit the KPK by act of KUHP and KUHP. What is your response? That's number 1. And number 2, have you heard about the comparative advantage on the telephones? What is your response? And
On the telephone production, manufacturing? Okay.
And have you heard about the Laffer curve? That is also typical public policy.
The what?
Laffer curve. It's when the
I forgot, honestly.
That's the economic policy, Republican policy.
Oh, okay.
When you're saying that, what is your response?
You mean lower the tax rates, the
Lower
bigger...
the tax rate, and but the basic is like
Look, my position is very clear on RUU KUHP.
Yep.
I'm not in favor of it because it nullifies and dilutes the strength of the KPK. Yeah. If any, I'm actually in favor of the opposite. Justru saya ngelihat kemuliaan Partai Demokrat di sini dalam arti kata dia membuahkan satu mekanisme yang memfasilitasi siapapun, nggak jenderal kek, nggak anak muda kek, nggak akademisi kek, nggak diplomat kek, nggak auditor kek, nggak apa, itu boleh ikut. Dan itu menurut saya ada 11 orang yang latar belakangnya bermacam-macam dan saya yakin ya kualitas edukasi politik di konvensi ini dahsyat. Tapi sayangnya nggak ditayangin aja. Jadi kalian nggak ngerti apa yang terjadi. Ya jujur aja apa yang saya omongin, ini apa yang saya paparin kalau saya berdebat. Bahkan lebih kaya lagi. Dan ini menurut saya, ya nggak tahu menurut Anda gimana? Ini cukup edukatif nggak?
banget.
Iya kan? Ini nggak ditayangin di TV. Nah, ini bukan saya aja, ada 10 calon yang lain loh. Yang memberikan paparan mengenai apa visi mereka, mengenai diplomasi, mengenai ekonomi, mengenai pertahanan, dan segalanya, dan segalanya. Dan ini ada 60 juta anak muda yang punya hak pilih. Dan 40% di Indonesia itu golput semua. Kenapa? Karena mereka apatis, pesimis, sinis, dan blenger sama politikus. Korup, nggak kompeten, jual janji doang. Iya kan, munafik. Ini bukan suara Anda aja, ini suara keponakan saya. Ini suara anak-anak teman saya. Ini suara anak sepupu-sepupu saya. Dan saya belak-belakan sama mereka. Ya, saya bilang ke mereka, lu jangan sampai nggak golput. Apa jangan sampai golput? Sorry, saya mau ngetes aja masih bangun apa enggak. Lu jangan sampai golput. Kalau lu golput, gigit jari lo 5 tahun dapat pemimpin yang salah. Dan ya kalau nyoblos nggak perlu nyoblos gua, nyoblos siapa aja. Amin. Nggak gini loh, semakin banyak kita nyoblos, semakin kita bisa memitigasi resiko penyalahgunaan di TPS-TPS dan sistem pemilihan. Dan semakin kita bisa bukan hanya mempengaruhi proses politik, tapi nasib kita ke depan. Percaya sama saya. Ini ada 40% dari 170 juta yang golput. 60 juta. Dan ini kebanyakan anak-anak muda. Jadinya silahkan ditularkan semangat nyoblos ke teman-teman. Ya kalau mau nyoblos GW syukur alhamdulillah. Oke, berikutnya satu lagi mungkin. Oke, yang belakang deh.
My question is about public policy. Like, you know, I think that public policy is a very important thing for Indonesia because we only have a very few policymakers here. And then public policy is important not only for to be a policymaker. Public policy school is not only important to be a policymaker, but also to other sectors. And my question is, since you have experience in education and public policy overseas, and then we now have SGPP in Indonesia, what's the difference on taking a public policy education overseas in Indonesia? What's the benefit? I mean, of course, we see that SGPP is very new, but then again, I mean, if one day it has a reputation like Kennedy's and other public policy schools around the world, what's the benefit of taking it here instead of overseas?
Obviously, you can have good Indonesian food every day. If you go to Boston, you'll have a tough time finding Indonesian food. And you can see your boyfriend or your mom and dad just about every other day. Unless you want to see your boyfriend more often. Or husband, or what. I think the proximity to your roots, you know, it's not only from a familial standpoint, but it deals with the unique attributes of this country. This country is rich of experiences that no other nation has. What are those? The maritime nature of this country. The anti- or counter-terrorism efforts that have been exemplary to the world. The US, Australia, European countries, India have all applauded what we have done in terms of countering terrorism. And what we have done in terms of resolving horizontal conflicts, whether they're ethnic or religious. And I think these are beautiful attributes of Indonesia that I think will position SGPP uniquely next to any other policy school. And look, any policy school in Indonesia should be, I think, cognizant of Indonesia's unique strengths. And those strengths are unique, I'm telling you. They're not strengths that other countries can have. Tsinghua University cannot talk about counterterrorism the way we can. Tsinghua University or Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy cannot talk about maritime affairs the way we can talk about. And these are stuff that I think our policymakers or future policymakers need to understand, on top of the fact that they're going to be learning what it takes to be a manager, what it takes to be negotiating, what it takes to be a number cruncher. When I took policy, studies or school, I took, different courses that taught me how to be a better manager, a better negotiator, and net, a better policymaker. And it boils down to that 4.5 million public officials in Indonesia, many of which are going to be attritioning out in the next 5 to 10 years. They need to be replenished with good quality. And if not, the risk of our not being able to attain above 6% growth rate with equity is not small. Thank you all. I love you all. Cukup? Unless udah cukup ya? Oke. Thank you.
Terima kasih banyak, Pak.
Sama-sama. Sukses. Boleh.
Pak Gita foto, Pak. Pak Gita foto. Pada besok ketemu di kantor.
Buat 1, 2.
Sip.
Thank you.
Thank you.
so much, Pak.
Sambil.
Pak.
Thank you.
Thank you. Gimana?
Pak boleh minta tanda tangannya, Pak?
Boleh.
Boleh salaman dulu, Pak.
Sukses
Saya
ya.
vote nanti.
Ayo. Oh,
Walaupun
sini ya.
Pak SBY tapi nggak apa-apa.
Oh, oke.
Tinggal klik aja ya.
Ya. Sip.
Saya ambilin.
Thanks.
Coba.
Makasih. Ayo foto. Ayo.
1, 2, 3. 1, 2.
Makasih ya Pak.
Sama-sama. Sukses.
have a photo with you?
Yes, please.
Boleh Anda ya?